This very well might be the most brutalistic building in the entire United States of America. It features bunker-like slit windows, exterior bathroom column bays which make the structure appear to have gills or some type of organic growth, as well as the so-called dustbuster air vents, features that many have associated with the set of a Star Wars movie, as others, perhaps more aesthetically sensitive, have called weaponized. To be fair here, no one could blame you for thinking that that was the architect's intention. I mean, look at this. The giant, single-story concrete air intake hoods that cover the lower level are understandably the most polarizing part of the building. They're heavy, angled downward over the entry, and create an intense feeling of anxiety. Additionally, there are these sky-high exhaust stacks at the very top of the building that can be seen from miles away. And to top it all off, like many raw concrete structures in the city, decades of the elements has taken its toll, leaving dramatic, dark streaks of carbon and water staining across the surface. To the average person, in the context of the weathered appearance, the building doesn't come across as a historic landmark. Rather, it looks industrial, neglected, and grim. And yet this brutalist building is not a bunker or anything of the sort. It's a hospital, and when it was constructed, it was thought to be a masterpiece, a symbol of tomorrow. So what's the story behind this monstrosity, and why are there so many scary-looking air vents? Stay tuned to find out as we discover the story of Chicago's Hospital of the Future. I'm your host Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. To understand how this type of architecture found its way to America, we first have to understand something fundamental about how World War II changed Western perception of culture. You see, before the war, Americans had widely embraced the European norms of architecture. Buildings of heavy stone represented permanence over the individual. Grand Roman motifs could be erected as psychological weapons to suggest conquer, whereas Greek symmetry suggested order and reason. So, from the time of the American forefathers to the mid-20th century, these same concepts were implemented. It made sense. The idea that you could rebuild Europe on US soil also gave the young society a feeling of legitimacy and 2,000 years of borrowed history. However, after World War II, when the best of European architecture laid in absolute rubble, everything changed. For context, millions of citizens on the old continent were now homeless, and the post-war population boom was just beginning. So governments realized that the old way of building, quarrying massive blocks of stone, carving marble columns, and hiring specialized stonemasons was a luxury of a world that no longer existed. Hence, to rebuild civilization before the winter hit, they needed a material that was cheap, universally available, and required zero artistic decoration. And that material was liquid concrete. According to most sources, the very first Brutalist tower was in France, completed in 1952 by a legendary architect who previously designed classical concepts. From there, it didn't take long before an ideological shift exacerbated everything. Across Europe, newly elected socialist and democratic socialist governments took power. These governments were introducing what many people call the welfare state. Things like free public health care, universities, and massive social housing programs for the working class. These were the absolute basics required for the world to function when everything else had been razed by war. To these new governments, classical European-style architecture represented the elites, the type of characters who had just dragged the entire world into two horrific wars. On the other hand, Brutalism was speaking the language of the public, the official style of the socialist state. There would be no more VIP entrances or first-class business lounges at train stations. Every square inch had to be for the people. So that's how the movement started in post-war Europe, which might leave you wondering, what does any of this have to do with the US? I mean, after the war, America was enjoying an economic and population boom. So why would anyone in that situation want to start building hospitals that look like they're from a dystopian nightmare? Well, this next part is rather ironic, because back in Europe, Brutalism was all about rejecting the elite, whereas in America, it was basically forced on the public by the elite and academia. As Hitler rose to power in Germany, his regime shut down some of Europe's most progressive design schools in the process, and many of the architects studying there fled to America, where, ironically, they were embraced by the country's highest institutions. So, for 2 decades after, these European masters trained an entire generation of elite American architects. But they were doing so from the new perspective that traditional European decoration was dead, and that modern materials like concrete, steel, and glass were the future. And despite the fact that they were now in America, they had taken their political baggage along with them. By the 1960s, the trainees of these European professors had entered the workforce and began winning contracts for both private and public developments. Around that same time, President Kennedy signed orders demanding that any new government building reflect the modern age. With that one pen stroke, the powder keg went off, and much of America's best architecture was toppled, only to be replaced by some of the most hideous buildings in history. In Boston, hundreds of historic buildings were razed to make way for the new City Hall. Over in Los Angeles, the Richfield Tower was coming down, as in Chicago, a hospital unlike anything ever seen was being planned. In the late 1960s, Chicago's West Town and Ukrainian Village neighborhoods were facing a problem. The medical center was completely overwhelmed by the population boom. Historically, the area was served by a hospital called the Sisters of the Holy Family of Nazareth. The original complex dates back to 1894, was expanded in 1902, and for over half a century, the facility provided a crucial safety net for the community. But with urban growth and the introduction of Medicare, the existing building was no longer able to meet the community's needs. And so the sisters running the operation were met with a difficult choice: relocate to a wealthy suburb or double down on their calling to serve the community. They chose the latter. In fact, they chose to rebuild. As you might imagine, financing a state-of-the-art 17-story skyscraper in the early 1970s was an immense financial undertaking. Yet the sisters managed to pull it off, with a multi-tiered fundraising campaign and the help of post-war federal programs. With the funds now in place, they sought an expert for the design. They hired Perkins & Will, one of Chicago's most elite architectural firms back then. The project was spearheaded by Todd Wheeler, a legendary master of healthcare architecture who had literally written textbooks on how to design the modern hospital. Wheeler was obsessed with a specific question: can a mechanized hospital be kept human? At that time, the early 70s, the architectural world was fully under the spell of brutalism. Wheeler and his co-designer believed that the old European style of building hospitals with those long, dark shared wards and hidden inaccessible piping was dangerously obsolete. And so he decided to design the building from the inside out. In the process, he used the raw, honest philosophy of brutalism to solve 3 major medical issues going on in the 70s. To prevent cross-contamination between patients, Wheeler wanted 100% private rooms, though to make room for that in a tight city footprint, he had to push all of the plumbing, ventilation, and patient bathrooms into those blocky concrete columns on the outside of the building. Then, he considered how a hospital might run with a smaller staff. In a traditional long corridor, nurses spent hours just walking up and down the hallways. So Wheeler arranged the private rooms in a geometric pinwheel shape around central nursing hubs, giving nurses a literal 360-degree view of their patients. And finally, he addressed the very real need for fresh air. Hospitals require massive amounts of continuous filtered air to prevent airborne illness. So instead of hiding the giant HVAC intakes, the architects proudly showcased them as massive, sculptural concrete hoods ringing the base of the building. So between the brutalist movement taking over the Western world and the honest need for function over aesthetics, the building came to look as it does, with its creepy vents and strange shapes. I'd also point out that when the 17-story concrete hospital opened its doors in 1975, it was hailed by the architectural community as a masterpiece of forward-thinking medical technology. And I assure you, if we were to look at this structure through the lens of the time, we'd be more likely to associate it with something out of the Jetsons. And I think we've all forgotten that notion, that excitement about the future world when technology will conquer the impossible. Anyhow, the new hospital had some very unexpected interiors as well. On the 3rd floor is a brutalist chapel with concrete walls following geometric lines that physically connect to the stations of the cross. And as great as this all was, little by little, the Hospital of the Future became one of the most polarizing, if not disconcerting, sights on the Chicago skyline. By the 1980s, popular culture shifted our collective visual perceptions. Movies like Blade Runner, RoboCop, and various other Cold War thrillers weaponized heavy, unpolished concrete architecture to represent oppressive, faceless governments and bleak futures. And with that, the locals quickly stopped seeing this as the futuristic medical machine it was intended to be. Rather, the structure came across as a symbol for authoritarianism. In turn, Chicagoans nicknamed the building the Spaceship Hospital, the Fortress, or the Star Wars Hospital. And a common piece of neighborhood humor was that it didn't look like a place where you would get well. Rather, it looked like a high-security detention facility. To make matters worse, as rainwater had mixed with urban soot and exhaust fumes over the decades, the building's deep geometric crevices had become stained. And so, based on appearances, the hospital no longer looked like the sterile clinic that it was. In contrast, a new trend called evidence-based design took over the medical world. Psychological studies proved that patients heal faster, experience less pain, and suffer less anxiety when their environment features natural light, soft colors, views of nature, and open glass structures. This new philosophy cast an even harsher light on St. Mary's design. Those very features the original architects were so proud of suddenly felt toxic. The shadowed windows were deeply recessed between the concrete bays to protect patient privacy, a choice well intended, but from the street, it looked suffocating. The bizarre, overhanging vents also intimidated patients who were likely already feeling anxious about their visit. In other words, the building is what some architects have dubbed a Frankenstein monster. The jarring mashup shocks the public and feels like two completely different structures have been awkwardly smashed together. Even so, when all is said and done, buildings like this deserve to be celebrated for their uniqueness alone. Think about this. A convent of nuns had created one of the scariest looking buildings in America, and yet practically speaking, the functionality was brilliant. Fresh air, privacy, and efficiency had all been accomplished. The community was served, and we should also acknowledge that this building is here to stay. Unlike many of those classical European buildings we've discussed over the years, there's really been no talk of demolishing Chicago's ugliest building. So that's the story of Chicago's hospital from the future. I hope all of you enjoyed it and will consider hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss what we do next. Also, if you have an episode idea, feel free to share that by using our request form in the description. Otherwise, as always, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.